So this is Jerusalem in the time of David. Okay. And so you can see at the beginning of this, about 4 millennia ago, so around 2000 BC, Melchizedek was the king of Jerusalem, which was then called Salem. And if you remember that account, it's found in Genesis. Abraham actually pays him a tithe. And so he's the priest king. He's a Christ figure, a Christ type in Genesis. He's very mysterious. We don't know much about him, but his priesthood is mentioned numerous times, especially in the book of Hebrews, that his priesthood is superior to that of, like, say, Levi and the Old Testament, the priesthood, the order of Melchizedek. It's also referenced in one of David's Psalms, Psalm 110, where he says, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand, and I have sworn that you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." And so this connection to Jerusalem goes way back, and it goes back that far. Okay, then it says in your note there, this was an unwalled city which was taken over in 1850 BC by the Jebusites, one of those Canaanite style or Semitic style tribes, who built a city wall around it and called it Jebus. King David captured the city, and we're going to look at that today, after having ruled for 7 years in Hebron. The city was strongly fortified, especially in the area around the Gihon Spring, where massive towers dating from this period have been excavated. The Jebusites were so confident of their fortifications that they taunted David, saying that even the blind and the lame would prevent him from capturing their city. However, Joab, David's commander-in-chief, managed to secretly enter the city through its water system and open the gates for David to take control. The Jebusite citadel was destroyed and replaced by the stronghold of Zion, that is, the city of David. Later on in his life, David built an altar on the threshing floor of Anuah the Jebusite, which stopped a plague sent by God upon Israel from reaching Jerusalem. Okay, so you can see that we know where these locations are on that map that you have there or projected on your screen. But you can see that there's some references there, okay, both in Chronicles and in Samuel. Mount Moriah, famously, where the Temple Mount eventually ends up being, is where Abraham was told to sacrifice Isaac. Okay, it's also in the book of Genesis. And so there's a lot of connections here. Now, so you have Melchizedek, you have Abraham and Isaac, and of course, that very famous line, "Father, Father, where's the sacrifice?" And Abraham says, "The Lord will provide the sacrifice. The Lord will provide the ram." And then right when he's at the moment to kill his own son, you have the stop, Abraham, and there's a ram provided, right? A sacrifice provided. So it makes that passage is really strange and only makes sense in the light of Christ. And so we get that, but that occurs on Mount Moriah. So you can see that's why that's located there. And that's the so-called mount, right? And then the rock is there now. And of course, the Islamic Dome of the Rock now stands over that site right now. And the city itself is divided into 4 quarters, the old city. It has 2 Christian quarters, a Jewish quarter, and a Muslim quarter. And so it's a really interesting kind of city, the old walled city. And so I'm going to show you some things from this. First off, it's called Salem in Genesis, but we have Jerusalem mentioned in numerous texts throughout this Middle East, in the Middle East, because some people say, well, Jerusalem was just a cow town by the time we get to David. This is the Bible in the Old Testament made Jerusalem seem bigger and badder and more important than it really was. Solomon and David were just tribal leaders. They weren't real kings. Well, that's not really true, because as we look in Egyptian texts and Assyrian texts, it's mentioned as a prominent and important city well before David and Solomon. For example, in Egyptian texts from the 1700s, it's called Yerushalayim. You can hear it kind of in the name, Jerusalem, right? Or later Egyptian, Jerusalem, right? 1300s BC, the Amarna letters. These are letters from Egypt to Semitic peoples of, like, say, Assyria and Babylon. They're writing letters back and forth in cuneiform writing, and it's called Jerusalem. If it was just a cow town, they're probably not going to mention this in the Amarna letters. Okay, so it's a big deal in 1300s BC. And then in Assyrian text, right around the time of David and Solomon and later, it's called Jerusalemu. And so obviously Jerusalem was an important city even then. And so when somebody says to you, well, it was just a cow town and David and Solomon were just tribal leaders, say that's not what the Middle Eastern literature says about it, because almost all the surrounding cultures say this city matters. And we have this in text. By the way, the Amarna letters look like that. So again, you can see the wedge-shaped writing, cuneiform writing, right? It's called meaning wedge-shaped. Originally, it was a way of keeping track of trading goods. It was like 100, next to the threshing floor, 50 things of barley. We need to trade it. That's all it was. That's how it started. And then it becomes one of the world's first writing and most important and versatile writing systems, so much so that there are dozens of languages written in cuneiform writing. But in this cuneiform writing, we have Jerusalem mentioned. That's just one example of this. That's a Jebusite votive offering type cultic object. So I wanted you to see, so when David takes Jerusalem over from the Jebusites, this is an artifact that comes from Jerusalem under layers and layers and layers. And that's why the archaeology of Jerusalem, by the way, is really challenging, is because there are so many levels of civilization that have built themselves over Jerusalem over thousands of years. I mean, that's 4,000 years ago with Melchizedek, right? And there could be stuff that precedes him even, right? Iron Age type stuff. We're talking Iron Age, Bronze Age, Stone Age type things. And by the way, those ages aren't talking about like cavemen or evolution or anything like that. It's just what's the dominant technology. That's all what that means. So Stone Age means they're using rocks, right? Iron Age, they're using iron. Bronze Age, they're using bronze. And so all it is just what's the dominant technology. It has nothing to do with some sort of evolutionary theory. That's really kind of an outdated way of looking at things. Because if that were true, you get some really nasty and unfortunate assumptions about peoples, which actually does happen in the 1800s. For example, when the colonists show up in the New World, the Native Americans at the time were living as a Paleolithic, a Stone Age society in the 1600s AD, right? Does that mean that they're less evolved? Well, nobody wants to say that, obviously. So obviously we got a problem, right? So what it really means is technology, just so we're clear on that. My whole point is in Jerusalem, you can go layer after layer after layer after layer after layer after layer, and then some of the layers mix together because they have minor earthquakes or there's been destruction, right? The Romans burned Jerusalem, the Muslims came in, the Crusaders came in, but even before that, the Babylonians came in, the Assyrian, I mean, there's all these different groups that have come through that area. So it's really, really difficult for archaeologists to actually get into this. And then the other part of this is because of the political nature of what's been going on in the last, 80, 90 years in the Middle East, certain groups don't want archaeologists to come in because it strengthens the claims, especially of the Israelis. Because the more we uncover stuff under the Temple Mount, the more we see how ancient the Hebrew presence there is. It certainly predates the Muslim presence there. And so because of that, there's rumors, and there are rumors of Muslim authorities trying to destroy or get rid of some of this archaeological evidence under the Temple Mount because it's been there for forever. Because they've been there since 1000 BC, really, with the rise of David. And so we know this archaeologically, not only in the Old Testament texts, which of course as Christians is the most important, but also in archaeology and in the surrounding Middle Eastern context. We know that the Jews have been there for a very, very, very long time. Okay. By the way, this is a GIF. You'll see this. If you see Jerusalem, this is probably what it originally looked like. So it'll do it again here. I wanted you to see the graphics on this as it kind of does. It'll do it one more time for you. When you go to Jerusalem right now, there you go. It looks like that. Does that make sense? There's that famous Dome of the Rock. But then if you actually reconstruct the temple walls in the temple, that's what it actually would have looked like on the Temple Mount. So I wanted you to be able to see that in reconstruction to give you a visual. So if you ever go to Jerusalem again, they'll let it do it one more time here before I get to our text. But I thought that was kind of cool to be able to see where it layers, right, on top of that.
Is there any reason why the dome appears to be exactly right on?
Yeah, because that's where the top of the mountain is. It's like they topographically, it's the highest spot, right? Yep. Now it seems flatter than it really is because of all the rubble and all the stone that's there, but it's there because it's the high point. And so the Dome of the Rock, the reason, if you don't know this, the claim is, and I'll say it that way, the claim is that Muhammad, in a kind of dreamlike prophecy or vision, was transported to this place and got kind of a vision of heaven from this rock. Okay, that's why it's called the Dome of the Rock. That's where they get that name. And so it's the third most holy site in Islam after Mecca and Medina. Mecca being ground zero, Medina, where Muhammad first ruled as kind of a warlord, as a prince, was in Medina. And then the third is the Dome of the Rock. And so that's why that's there as far as things go. But I wanted you to at least see that if you ever see Jerusalem from the outside, and when you say go up to Jerusalem, it really was going up to Jerusalem. It sits on a high point, a high outcrop there, Mount Moriah. And so it's impressive. And all that business development and stuff that the Jews have done rather miraculously in some cases is all behind all the commercial district.
Where's that Wailing Wall?
So the Western Wall, that's going to be, let's see, I gotta orient myself. I might give you this wrong, but the Wailing Wall is going to be on I believe it's on the other side. I think it's then this, because I think you have to go to the other side. Does that make sense? Where the city is, I believe. Don't quote me on that, but I know it's not this side. So I think it's on the other side from the picture of this. You could ask somebody who's been to Jerusalem more than me because I've never been there. Okay, but I believe, if I'm remembering my orientation right.
I think you're looking on the Kidron Valley side.
Yeah.
So that's the
That'd be the eastern side.
Right, the opposite side, right. But it's easier to see where the mount would have been from there, which is why I think they set it there.
So Mount Moriah was on the outside of this old city of David, right? According to this map, it was outside the city, but now I assume it's part of the
Right, it's
city.
incorporated, yeah, it's
Yeah.
incorporated later, right?
Yeah.
This is, right, as it's taken over, right, you can kind of see how that works. So Mount Moriah initially was unsettled, right? And then you could see so if you look at those arrows there, forgive me if you're online, but we're looking at that original map. But Araunah's threshing floor, right, was where he built the altar to God, same place where Abraham built the altar to sacrifice his son. The walls are extended, right? So in other words, that hill here is incorporated later, right? And the old city is going to cover that whole hill, right? That's what you just saw. No, that's a good connection there, okay? There's David's palace, right? But eventually the temple and stuff is going to be erected there as well, okay? But yes, good clarification. All right, so I'm on Bible Gateway again, just because I like looking at these different translations. So I want to show how David becomes king or is anointed king of Israel. And then we're also going to look at 1 Chronicles 12, which gives us some extra information. It's kind of a flashback leading up to this. Now, Ralph asked about this. I'm glossing over a little bit of 1 Samuel 3 and 4. If you want to read that for yourself, you can. But for the interest of time, because I got to get to the kings too. What 3 and 4 have to do with is the succession dispute between Saul's family and David. And there are military commanders involved. So Saul's commander Abner, and then David's commander Joab, and there's a blood feud because there's a battle, and Abner kills one of Joab's kinsmen. And so Abner eventually switches sides to come over to David, but Joab, because he's angry about this blood feud, actually basically murders Abner. And Abner is buried in one of Saul's son's tombs. And so it's this succession dispute that goes on. And then David actually, says, so then after Abner is killed, and other people are killed, Ishbosheth, he's another successor of Saul, is killed. David actually kills the guy who murders Ishbosheth because David's like, this is the death penalty. You committed murder. You really think I'm going to be proud of you? Remember what happened when the guy came to me and said, I killed Saul and then I had him executed? Well, the same thing's going to happen to you. And that's what happens in 1 Samuel 3 and 4. So if I'm not ignoring it, but for theological purposes and to keep the class moving, we're going to start in 2 Samuel 5. 2 Samuel 5. Okay, so I'm going to be looking at, you can see here, if you want to see what parallels I have, the left is the ESV, the right is the New King James. Okay, so I'm going to read from the ESV, but you can see the New King James projected for you if you know that older language. So here we go. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. Okay, a couple of comments on this. Notice that the king is called a shepherd. Okay, and that's important because when we get, of course, talking about Christ, when we think about the big prophecy, out of you, but you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, are not least in the cities of Judah, right? This is after David, who is from Bethlehem, after David's reign in the book of Micah. But you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, you are not least in the cities of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. So it's not by accident that shepherding motif is present here in 2 Samuel 5. Another thing about that as well, in Ezekiel, in the book of Ezekiel, if you get to the 30s in the book of Ezekiel, God's condemning the shepherds of the people and says, I myself will be their shepherd. Okay, now the shepherds at that time are the priests. So that shepherd motive is given both to priests and given to kings. Okay, so kings and priests are the shepherds of God's people. And so that should give you a little bit more context, right? When Jesus says, I am the good shepherd, right? I lay down my life for the sheep. There's a lot that's going on there. Or Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. All of that background in the Old Testament is present in the life and work of Christ. So I just want to point that out to you in 2 Samuel 5. So he's called the shepherd and prince. That's interesting. Okay, next, Samuel, starting in verse 4. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned for Judah 7 years and 6 months. And at Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. And the king, and here's where he conquers Jerusalem. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, you will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off, thinking David cannot come in here. It sounds odd in translation. You could see this here in the King James. You shall not come in here, but the blind and the lame will repel you, thinking David cannot come in here. And so that's why multiple translations are helpful to get the sense of what the Hebrew's trying to communicate. What's going on is they're taunting. Hey, David, our blind people and the lame people, our disabled people can defeat you because our walls are so strong and we are so impregnable that we could send our disabled people and still defeat you. It's It's Middle Eastern taunting. Okay, this is trash talking. 11th century, 9th century BC, Middle Eastern trash talking. Okay. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. And David said on that day, whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, quote unquote, who are hated by David's soul. Then it is said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. And David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built the city all around from the Millo inward. And David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. And Hiram, king of Tyre, this is an interesting figure. You will run into him again during the reign of Solomon. Now, if you graph all the numbers out in terms of how long David reigns, and then also how long Solomon reigns, there's some curiosity. Is this the same Hiram who sends the cedars of Lebanon to Solomon for the building of the temple? Or is this like an ancestor where Hiram's sort of a family name? We really don't know. The cedars of Lebanon, by the way, which were world famous at this time, have all but disappeared. Think about this. You got 2,000 or 3,000 years of harvesting these trees, right? And they were very, very famous as the best wood you could get. No, they didn't have modern day horticulture, right? Or forest management. They didn't have that back then. And so they've all been disappeared. Some of it's the climate has changed since then, of course, too. But really, it's just years and years and years of harvesting and that sort of thing. But here we have Hiram, king of Tyre, who's a figure that will again show up with Solomon. He sent messengers to David and cedar trees and carpenters and masons who built David a house. And David knew that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. And David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he'd come from Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to David. And these are the names of those who were born to David to him in Jerusalem: Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, Solomon, Ibhar, Elusha, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, and this one I always get, Eliphalet. Eliphalet. I always say that one works as the two L's. Eliphalet. So David has, and this is a whole other topic we'll get to later. David, of course, is called a man after God's own heart because of his repentance and because of the way he humbles himself and the way he tries to seek after God. But one of the ways that David has a character flaw, and his son's going to have this even to a bigger extreme, is David adds wives and concubines to himself. The book of Deuteronomy tells the king not to do that. And so this is an example of David's character flaw. He's still a sinner, right? He may be the king par excellence of the Old Testament, but he's still a sinner. He's not even listing here. These are just some of the sons. If you get through Chronicles and some other passages, you can create like a list of all the children of David. We know he at least has one daughter. Certainly he had more daughters just by mathematical odds, right? Because we have some stuff that goes on with a succession dispute later on here in 2 Samuel. And so we know that he has at least one, multiple daughters, certainly. So he has dozens and dozens of children, is the point. But the big prominent ones are being listed here in 2 Samuel 5. So he's adding, by the way, concubines are not like prostitutes. They're lower class wives. They just simply didn't require a bride price. And so they were technically legal wives. Okay. And so if you were despoiling another man's concubine, you were committing adultery. Okay. This wasn't like, does that make sense? This wasn't. So it's a legal institution in the Middle East as far as this goes. So David is not sinning in that sense, in that he's like, it's not like adulterous, at least at the time it's not considered adulterous, but it's certainly a violation that he was not supposed to be adding all these wives and concubines. That was condemned in the book of Deuteronomy. I just wanted to mention that here as he increases his power. And the reason this is here is to show he's a prince, to show he's the king, to show that he is the leader of all the tribes of Israel. And by accumulating all these wives and concubines, it's reaffirming that he has this level of authority. We don't know because of the concubines. It never lists the exact amount of concubines. We don't know because a concubine is a wife, right? We know some of the names of his wives. Like he has Michal or Michael, right, from Saul. By the way, she's taken away from him and then given back to him. That's a whole big mess. We can talk about that some other time too. But then he also marries Abigail, right? We know her from 1 Samuel. And so we have a couple other wives that are mentioned, minor wives that we don't know much about. And then we have these other wives and concubines. Because if you look at this, he already has wives. And then here we are at 2 Samuel 5:13, and David took more concubines and wives. So we actually don't have an exact amount. Solomon, of course, has 1,000 concubines, supposedly.
So is it only the first incident that, of course, it's well known where he kind of commits adultery, where he's confronted on it? Is that the only one that shows up in the Bible? I guess that didn't even.
No, and he's not even really, the condemnation here would be very subtle.
Okay.
Right? It's not like Nathan showed up and saying, hey, why are you adding all these wives and concubines? Right? The only reason we know that this might be a subtle hint that David's not completely everything that he's supposed to be is Deuteronomy. And you can look this up, and I'll give you the exact reference later. We can look this up later. But in Deuteronomy, it says, if you have a king, this is what the king should do. And one of the things that the king should not do is add wives to himself. So it's a subtle, actually I can pull it out I think I have my commentary here somewhere, but I'll pull it up. Might be in the back somewhere, but I'll pull it up later. But oh, it's right here. There it is. In the Concordia commentary, he basically mentions this and says, I'll find it for you really quick since we're talking about it. That's verse 13 here.
Most or all of the patriarchs had more than one wife, didn't they?
A lot of them did, but again, it always leads to heartbreak, right? With Leah and Rachel, it creates rivalries and stuff like that. So here we go, David's kingdom. Yeah, so if you wanted, I can copy this off for you or give you the list. These are all of David's children born in Jerusalem. When you combine 2 Samuel with First Chronicles, look at all those kids. If you can see them in the back, see all these kids? So, I mean, he's having lots of kids there. Okay, it says David's children. We are told that David had, I'll read from the commentary here. We are told that David had concubines and wives. Both were considered married to David, but a concubine was not acquired by the paying of a bride price as was a wife. David's acquisition of many wives is also another subtle hint of David's flaws. He was disobeying the prohibition placed on Israel's kings in Deuteronomy 17:17. There you go. There's your reference. Deuteronomy 17. You can look that up for yourself later. You are not to add wives to yourself in Deuteronomy 17. It has been suggested that David's concubines and wives from Jerusalem were maybe even Jebusite women. If this was the case, then David's reason for leaving the Jebusites in Jerusalem can be explained as his using the existing bureaucratic structure of the city to run everyday affairs, and his marriages with Jebusite women would have been to secure the loyalty of key Jebusites. Solomon does the same thing, only instead of a local tribe, he does it with international relations, right? Like Pharaoh's daughter. And so Solomon's copying his dad, just on a greater and much more a large extent. It says, however, they would have exerted a pagan influence on him unless they were converted to faith in Yahweh. Again, the author may be hinting at flaws in David's character that would exhibit themselves more fully later in 2 Samuel. Make sense? So that's why we think this is there. So if you want that reference to look up, it's Deuteronomy 17. Go ahead.
David made the covenant with the elders. Would this 17:17 have been part of that covenant? You're not going to take on it.
Yeah, the elders and especially the priestly members that would have been present, they would have known that passage because that was in the Torah, the instruction, right? Those first 5 books. And so certainly the leaders of the time, especially the priestly leaders, the tribe of Levi and the high priest and his family, they would have known that prohibition.
Do they have a responsibility to come to him when he's king and say, hey, you're not supposed to be doing this?
Yeah. They're supposed to talk to him, especially the prophet of God, like a Nathan, right? Yeah. Or whoever the high priest is, people like, let's see, who's Zadok the priest, right? People like that. Zadok's going to show up with Solomon. They certainly have that authority. Whether or not they did, we don't have it. It's just mentioned here. It's just recorded. Whether or not he was criticized or was even open to criticism, we don't know. But that shows you again that there's issues. David's not perfect. All right, so now that David's king, the Philistines are thinking they can go take him out early, and they're going to try to fight with David twice here in 2 Samuel. When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, all the Philistines went up to search for David. But David heard of it and went down to the stronghold. Now the Philistines had come and spread out in the valley of Rephaim, and David inquired of the Lord, shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand? And the Lord said to David, go up, for I will certainly give the Philistines into your hand. And David came to Baal Perazim, and David defeated them there. And he said, the Lord has broken through my enemies before me like a breaking flood. Therefore, the name of that place is called Baal Perazim. And the Philistines left their idols there, and David and his men carried them away. When you carry away the enemy's idols or destroy their idols, that's a symbolic victory over their gods. So that's a big deal. So David's basically saying Yahweh conquered these gods. Okay, so that's first thing. Second thing, notice the difference between David and Saul here. When Saul was confronted with the Philistines, he's terrified. He goes and hides. He hides behind his army. He doesn't know what to do. He wrings his hands. He inquires of the Lord, and the Lord doesn't give him the answer that he wants. And he tries to, sacrifice things early before Samuel even gets there. Saul is not a person of character. David actually inquires the right way. So inquiring of the Lord, as a reminder, was to talk to the high priest, and the high priest used the so-called Urim and Thummim. We've talked about this before, and we don't know exactly how this works. We have some hints. One meant like day, it's like day and night, or light and darkness. So we don't know exactly how that was done. But again, we know that there was a way of getting a yes or a no, right, to go up. And so in this case, he inquired the right way through the priest, and God told him to go up. Okay, so the Philistines left their idols. David conquers those idols and shows that Yahweh is superior. It continues. And the Philistines came up yet again and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. And when David inquired of the Lord, he said, you shall not go up. Go around to their rear and come against them opposite the balsam trees. And when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, then rouse yourself. For then the Lord has gone out before you to strike down the army of the Philistines. And David did as the Lord commanded him and struck down the Philistines from Geba to Gezer. So the first time he defeats them, but it's more of just kind of like a victory, but the war is not over. So they regather and come back against David near Jerusalem. And David, instead of meeting them head on, goes around them. This is like a flanking maneuver, right? And is in the trees, so he's hidden. God tells him to do this, so God's giving him a military tactic, which is interesting. Maybe that would have helped Saul if Saul would have actually done what he was supposed to do. So God gives him a tactic. He goes into the balsam trees, so he's got cover, flanks, and then attacks, and then defeats the Philistines. And Gezer is actually out towards Philistine territory. So not only does he defeat them, he actually pursues them back to where they're supposed to be. Okay, so they're not going to mess with David anymore. The Philistines are done. Shows you how often they're a thorn in David's side, though, right? Over and over and over again, it seems the Philistines are always pursuing them. And that's actually where we get the name Palestine, by the way.
Not unlike today.
Yeah, the Philistines, Palestinia is the Roman Latin translation of Philistia. So the word Palestine is the land of the Philistines. And the Romans used that as a region. Some people think it was an insult. Some people think it was just because the Romans didn't give a rip and they just called it something, which is probably the most likely because the Romans were all about business and they're very efficient. So it wasn't necessarily anti-Jewish as much as it was, we're just going to call it whatever we want to call it. Does that make sense? Because that was just the Roman way of doing things. But Philistia, Palestine, is the Latin version of that. That's where that word comes from. And so the land of the Philistines. Anyway, anybody have, yeah, go ahead.
Where would David be talking to the Lord?
At wherever the Ark of the Covenant is, where the tabernacle is, okay, right? So he would be talking, or wherever the high priest is, and the priest is there with him. It doesn't say specifically like he's in a certain house. Like in 1 Samuel, we do have that, right? That Eli was at a certain place, right, at Shiloh, and that he and his sons were there, and the Ark of the Covenant was there, right? And there was a very specific place. We think it's probably at Hebron, because that's where David was king for 7 years, and the Ark is not in Jerusalem yet. So he's either going to Hebron or the high priest is just with him, would be the other argument here. Because in 2 Samuel 6, the Ark of the Covenant is going to come. Okay, and that's where we're going to get that in. And 2 Samuel 7, if you want to know the drama of this, God's going to make the messianic promise to David that he's going to have a ruler forever.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, spoiler alert, right? So that's my goal here is to get. So right now we're doing this backstory, getting David established as king, and then two huge, and I mean that, huge theological chapters in 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel 6 and 2 Samuel 7 are like fundamental theological chapters for this that really we want to spend some time in because they echo throughout all of Scripture moving forward. But yes, it would have either been at Hebron or the high priest was just simply following him because he was the king. It's one or the other. Okay, so now that's for 2 Samuel 5. So if you have your outline, this thing here, you have some notes for you on this. I just want to kind of point this out. Most of this is giving you some just some background historically. That huge chunk from 6 to 13 gives you some of the same information I gave you about the history of Jerusalem, that it's present, and also what the Millo is. Okay, and then it talks about the statement of David's kingship and his and who they are, and then it talks about the Philistines. So if you want to see that on the bottom, my note that I want to just draw your attention to is the bottom of page 1. Until now, the Philistines may have considered that David was to some extent still their vassal. Remember in 1 Samuel, David actually flees to the Philistines. First, he acts insane, right? And then he actually works for them for a while because he's being pursued by Saul. So they may have considered him a lesser. They want to teach David a lesson. Who's really in charge is the message here. At least they must have been happy about his struggle with Ishbosheth. That's one of Saul's sons. But when David becomes king over Israel and even captures Jerusalem, they realize that he is a threat going down to the stronghold. This is probably a stronghold towards the Philistine country. The valley of Rephaim is a valley leading towards Jerusalem from the southwest. The incident in 2 Samuel 23 may also have happened at this time. I'm going to mention why that's important in a second. David inquired of the Lord, as he did in all those other passages, like a bursting flood. Throughout the ancient Near Eastern writings, battles are described in terms of floods. Baal and Baal Perazim is a common noun meaning Lord. Okay, there we go. So then the Philistines left their idols, which is a reversal of 1 Samuel 4. Okay, and David has those idols burned. Now, my point is, if you see that note there, it says the incident in 2 Samuel 23, 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, but especially 2 Samuel is almost certainly not in chronological order. Okay, and so it takes some detective work and some harmonization with 1 Chronicles also to figure out exactly what order and what date these events happen in, because they are almost certainly telescoped or in topical order or just giving you accounts of David's reign. They are almost certainly not in actual chronological order. And so that should be something that you know. So if you hear an atheist or a skeptic say to you, well, this happened, but then 1 Chronicles says this happened. Which one is right? Well, aren't you assuming that everything's in chronological order? Because, for example, when as a history teacher, I'm just going to give you a little side here. As a history teacher, I do not always do things in chronological order. Sometimes I do things topically, and that's okay, right? And actually, most history books will do that too. And so if I showed you my U.S. history textbook, I have an Oxford U.S. history textbook. It'll say the embattled farmer, and it'll say like 1865 to 1905. And then the next chapter, it'll say moving west, 1865 to 1910. But wait a minute, I thought that was the embattled farmer. Why are we going backwards again? Well, it's just a different topic, right? Does that make sense? All history books have to choose and make those decisions. So in the same way, in 2 Samuel, sometimes it's just giving you these accounts and going back and telling you different stories topically or for a different theological reason. But 2 Samuel is almost certainly not in chronological order, which is why Chronicles is so valuable for us. So I'm going to use Chronicles now. That's my segue here. 1 Chronicles 12. Remember, 1 Chronicles 1 through 10, 11 is just genealogies, right? I mentioned those before the break. But now we get the narrative. Okay, so 1 Chronicles 12. And so as David is accomplishing power for himself or accumulating power for himself, and really we would say God is blessing him and God is acknowledging him as king and all the tribes of Israel show up, 1 Chronicles gives us a greater idea of what this looks like as he's accumulating all these people and becoming king. And I want to show this because I used this passage 2 years ago when I taught a class, and we'll see if you recognize the verse. Here we go. Now, these are the men who came to David at Ziklag when he could not move about freely because of Saul, the son of Kish. So this is a flashback, but it's showing how David arranged power, because in 1 Chronicles 11, David's already king. So we know this is a flashback. Again, flashback. Again, chronological order, not a thing. And these were the mighty men who helped him in war. They were bowmen and could shoot arrows and sling stones with either the right or the left hand. They were Benjamites, Saul's kinsmen. That's interesting. So you have people from Saul's tribe that are actually acknowledging David as king. The chief was Ahaziah, then Joash, both sons of Shema at Gibeah. Also Jeziel and Pelet, the sons of Osmaveth, Berkah, Jehu of Anathoth, Ishmael of Gibeon, a mighty man among the 30 and a leader over 30, Jeremiah, Jahziel, Johanan, Josabad. You can see the whole list, right? Then it continues, verse 8. From the Gadites, there went over to David at the stronghold in the wilderness, mighty and experienced warriors, expert with shield and spear, whose faces were like the faces of lions, who were swift as gazelles upon the mountains. What's going on here? They're trying to show you that David is a mighty military leader and that the best of Israel, are supporting David at this point, right? The best warriors, the best leaders, okay? And you get another list of people, right? And they're listed, right, in order. Who's the chief of them? Who's the second? Who's the third? They're ranked, okay? The Gadites were officers of the army. The least was a match for 100 men, and the greatest for 1,000. These are the men who crossed the Jordan in the first month, when it was overflowing all its banks, and put to flight all those in the valleys, to the east and to the west. And some of the men of Benjamin and Judah came to the stronghold of David. Remember the stronghold was mentioned here at the Philistines? That's probably what this is. David went out to meet them and said to them, if you have come to me in friendship to help me, my heart will be joined to you. But if to betray me to my adversaries, although there is no wrong in my hands, then may the God of our fathers see and rebuke you. Then the Spirit clothed Amasai, the chief of the 30, and he said, we are yours, O David, and we are with you, O son of Jesse. Peace be speedy you, and peace to your helpers, for your God helps you. Then David received them and made them officers of his troops. Now, here we go. Some of the men of Manasseh deserted to David when he came with the Philistines for the battle against Saul. Yet he did not help them, for the rulers of the Philistines took counsel and sent him away, saying, at our peril to our heads, he will desert to his master Saul. And so you can see this kind of like interplay. It's like, so David's serving the Philistines, they're fighting Saul, and then the Philistines are like, wait a second, he might betray us because he's really just an Israelite, so let's not let him fight. That kind of interesting. So you can see kind of the political machinations that are going on. As he went to Ziklag, that is David, these men of Manasseh deserted to him, and you get another list. They helped David against the band of raiders, for they were all mighty men of valor and were commanders in the army. For from day to day, men came to David to help him until there was a great army, like an army of God. Now, let's see if you catch the verse. These are the numbers of the divisions of the armed troops who came to David in Hebron to turn the kingdom of Saul over to him, according to the word of the Lord. The men of Judah, bearing shield and spear, were 6,800 armed troops. Of the Simeonites, mighty men of valor, of war, 7,100. These are huge numbers in the ancient Near East, just so you know. Of the Levites, 4,600. The prince Jehoiada of the house of Aaron, with him 3,700. Yes, the priestly family had to fight. Okay. Zadok, a young man mighty in valor, and 22 commanders from his own father's house. Of the Benjamites, the kinsmen of Saul, 3,000, of whom the majority had to that point kept their allegiance to the house of Saul. Of the Ephraimites, 20,800, mighty men of valor, famous men in their fathers' houses. Of the half-tribe of Manasseh, 18,000, who were expressly named to come and make David king. Of Issachar, men who had understanding of the times, to know what Israel ought to do, 200 chiefs, and all their kinsmen under their command. Of Zebulun, 50,000 seasoned troops equipped for battle with all the weapons of war to help David with singleness of purpose. Of Naphtali, 1,000 commanders, with whom there were 37,000 men armed with shield and spear. Of the Danites, 28,600 men equipped for battle. Of Asher, 40,000 seasoned troops ready for battle. Of the Reubenites and Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh from beyond the Jordan, 120,000 of men armed with all the weapons of war. All these men of war, arrayed in battle order, came to Hebron with a whole heart to make David king over all Israel. Likely all the rest of Israel were of a single mind to make David king. And they were with David for 3 days, eating and drinking, for their brothers had made preparation for them. And also their relatives, from as far as Issachar and Zebulun and Naphtali. Those are the northern tribes. Remember, Jerusalem's in the south, okay, as is Hebron and Ziklag. As far as Issachar, Zebulun, and Naphtali came bringing food on donkeys and on camels and on mules and on oxen, abundant provisions of flour, cakes of figs, clusters of raisins, and wine and oil, oxen and sheep, for there was joy in Israel. Does anybody recognize the verse from this, what I used? This is a famous passage, and I use this very quick. It's the men of Issachar, right? Starting in verse 32, men who had understanding of the times, who knew what Israel ought to do. And so I taught that class called Understanding the Times. That's what this is for, right? And so we are spiritual Israel, right? So one of the reasons I use this verse is we need people, we need shields and spears, right? Like that, right? And of course, it's spiritual warfare, right? But we need that. And the way Vodi Bach, a big African-American preacher, will say about this, he'll say, shields, spears, you need all that, right? He's like, but you also need men who understand the times. And David has men around him who understand the times. Another part that you may not have noticed in this that's awesome too, with Zebulun, men who have a singleness of purpose. Wouldn't it be nice if the church had singleness of purpose? Right? Right? The mission of Christ, word and sacrament. Wouldn't that be awesome? Committed to God. You see what I'm saying? There's application from this for us today. And that's why I wanted to close on this. We need to understand the times so we know what we ought to do as the people of God. And we also need people that are ready to fight the forces in this world. As Paul says in Ephesians, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the this present darkness, right? We struggle against that, right? We are making spiritual war in this world, not against flesh and blood, not against our neighbors who Jesus died for also, but against this present darkness, the prince of the one who has the power of the air, the devil, right? So we have spiritual war that's going on. A lot of the ideas that we face today are demonic ideas. They really are. You can ask my son. We've had some conversations. I'm fully convinced that some of the pathologies we experience in our culture have demonic or evil origin. I really do. And so our struggle, again, we are, as the people of God, in battle array, right? Onward Christian soldiers is in our hymnal. Do you know that? We don't sing it much because people misunderstand what it means. Okay. But we are God's soldiers, right? And we have to have people who not only understand the times, but people who have singleness of purpose and are arrayed to do God's bidding and fight for God's people. And so we can array in battle order for God. It's kind of cool to think that way, because we are God's people, the chosen of the Lord, right? So it's something to keep in mind. And so rather than serving David, though, to make David king, we have one who already is king, right? We already know who he is, and we already know who's going to win. So let's be on the right side. And in the meantime, let's get busy. Not because we want to earn our salvation, but because there's work to do and because we have a struggle that's going on in this world. And it's important to do this. So I'm inspired by this because here you look at this and we're like, here's David's troops arrayed in battle armor. Imagine now with those of us who have the gift of the Holy Spirit, how big God's army really is around the world. Because I'm fully convinced, Pastor Jim, when he was still here, Pastor Von Bush was good about this. He said, I'm convinced that the devil wants to make God's people, especially men, but really all of God's people, feel isolated and alone. He wants that. Because what do you do when you're isolated and alone? You get depressed, you get inactive, you think that you're the only one, you don't do anything, you don't live out your baptism, you just try to survive, right? And so Jim's like, I'm fully convinced. But if you could actually see the amount of people that are on God's side and God's army, the people that he's redeemed, the people that are redeemed and created in faith with the Holy Spirit, I think you'd be pretty inspired, right? We're going to get to Elijah later when he's like, there's nobody else. I'm alone in the cave. And God says, I count 10,000, right? And so this is an awesome passage. So we need to understand the times and also a singleness of purpose for God's cause, as we see here in 1 Chronicles 12. All right, we need to end. My kids are back there in the end, which means it's time to go. It's a good alarm clock. And some of you need to go to the 11 o'clock service. So let's say the blessing. The Lord bless us and keep us. The Lord make his face shine upon us and be gracious unto us. The Lord lift up his countenance upon us and give us peace. Amen. All right, so 2 Samuel 6
Thank you, Aaron.
next week.